Welcome all to the second day of the Computational and Experimental Chemistry Symposium. The symposium is dedicated to bringing together the computational simulation community and experimental researchers to exchange scientific ideas and to learn the current state-of-the-art modeling, analytical and numerical tools together with advanced experimental techniques. We hope that our attendees, colleagues and their families are safe in the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Today, there will be two lectures presented by Professor Lev Sarkisov from the University of Manchester and Dr. Valentina Erastova from the University of Edinburgh. I am Dmitry Lepshin, a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh and an initiator of this series of lectures. Questions to our speakers from Zoom and YouTube will be moderated by me. Please use chats to ask questions at any time. I would like to acknowledge technical support provided by the International Adsorption Society and Dr. Dan Siderius in particular. Now I would like to introduce the first speaker, Professor Lev Sarkisov. Professor Lev Sarkisov is the head of the Department of Chemical Engineering and Analytical Science at the University of Manchester. His research interests include molecular simulations in application to chemical engineering problems, materials science, and biomolecular systems. Some of his contributions include, for example, post-structure characterization software such as PoreBlazer. He also contributed to an understanding of pore blocking effects in porous materials. He also works on morph screening techniques and many other fields. So now I would like to give a word to Professor Lev Sarkisov.
All right. So I can start my video. So Dmitry, thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. So I can stop sharing your screen and go to my screen. All right. Dmitry, can you hear me and can you see my presentation?
Yes, I can hear you and I see a presentation.
Okay, so thank you very much. So thank you very much, Dmitry, for organizing this event. Of course, it would be much nicer for all of us to congregate onto Edinburgh, but this is the new reality, so we're going to do this Zoom presentations. So thank you very much for organizing it. Now, the focus of this event was meant to bring PhD students from different backgrounds who would be interested in computational tools and how to use them to understand their practical experimental problems or to understand and interpret their experimental data. And when thinking about what it is I wanted to talk about, I realized two things. First of all, they're going to be very competent and actually technically in-depth introductions from my colleagues at this symposium on molecular simulations. And secondly, my own group, Dmitry and Amir, are going to be presenting in this symposium, and they're going to present work related to computational studies, molecular simulations, process simulations. And so from that point of view, there's going to be already significant content related to technical aspects of molecular simulations. So what I wanted to do is actually not to do that and to look at things that are not molecular simulations, slightly different things. And so from many points of view, my talk is going to be very conceptual, not very technical, and even in some parts, not exactly very rigorous science, but it is something that is going to improve our understanding of interesting and complex phenomena. Now, before I go into this part, I simply would like to acknowledge my collaborators. I work with many groups, but these are collaborators that are involved in the results covered in this particular presentation. Beren Smith, Richard Martin, Maciej Haranczyk, Mohamed Musavi, Stefan Kaskel, Jack Evans, Martin Swedman, Matthias Thomas, and Alex Nymark. This is a group of people who are related to this particular presentation. Now, a quick outline of what it is I wanted to talk about today. I'm going to make some fairly vague remarks on the role of computational chemistry and molecular simulations in science and in engineering. I would like to maybe pose a question on what it is actually we can ask with molecular simulations, and that possibly could be useful for PhD students who are interested in this area but are not sure what it is we can do in molecular simulations. And then I'm going to actually switch the gears and talk about things that are not molecular simulations as such, but still are in the domain of molecular thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. And I'm going to apply the concepts that are not molecular simulations to a particularly challenging problem of understanding the physics of flexible crystals, such as metalorganic frameworks. And then I'm going to pose some provocative questions and share with you things that I'm currently working on. Now, because the symposium is called a Symposium on Computational Chemistry, of course, we need to acknowledge that the 21st century started with a very significant milestone in computational chemistry by that has been, let's say, recognized with this Nobel Prize in computational chemistry awarded to Martin Karplus, Michael Levitt, and Eddie Warshall for essentially quantum mechanical calculations on computational chemistry. And that award simply recognized that what we can do now with the computers indeed uncovers completely new science and completely new physics that was not possible, let's say, 20, 30, or 40 years ago. And that is likely to significantly influence our technologies and how we develop as a humankind. But aside from theoretical computational chemistry, the point that I would like to make here in this presentation is that the availability of computers and computational chemistry methods also hugely influences engineering. And the point I would like to make is this: the future of engineering is going to look like this: big computers. Collectively, we already call the tendency of engineering to use computers Industry 4.0, where we leverage the power of computers to solve difficult problems and also to propose where we should concentrate our experimental effort. In fact, in a recent talk by Professor Jas Sipman in Manchester, he made this very interesting statement that 50% of data required for chemical engineering is already generated on a computer. And likely this trend is going to only grow. We are going to use it to really design chemical processes and focus experimental effort on really important things. And another, let's say, reference that I would like to provide is the talk by Professor Pablo Di Benedetti from Princeton University, who is a chemical engineer, who gave a talk on thermodynamics and the role of molecular thermodynamics and computational chemistry in chemical engineering. And there is a very interesting interview that Pablo is giving to Phil Westmoreland, available on YouTube, about his journey as a thermodynamicist in the computational engineering domain. So that is, computers is also the future of chemical engineering. That is kind of the point that I would like to start from. Now, computational chemistry and molecular simulations, they also broadly belong to a wider domain of statistical mechanics and molecular thermodynamics. And what I would like to do is to give you a brief maybe history of when and where computers came into this picture. In general, the objective of molecular thermodynamics is to develop an explanation and description of how macroscopic properties of thermodynamic systems emerge from how molecules interact. These are molecules interacting with each other, and somehow simply the way they interact gives rise to how systems behave. Vapor-liquid equilibria, crystallization, liquid-liquid equilibria, all these processes that are so important for chemical engineering problems. So the molecular thermodynamics is associated with this arrow, how we go from this knowledge to this knowledge. Now, before computers, we would have to develop a theory to do that. And of course, development of this theory and their foundations is associated with the names such as Josiah Gibbs in the United States, and Ludwig Boltzmann, and many others. So we would need to somehow develop simplified theories here to go from molecular interactions to thermophysical macroscopic phenomena. Now, in the 50s, computers emerged. And then the question is, why develop theories? You can simply simulate how molecules interact with each other and see if you can get a similar picture. And in fact, the relationship between theory and simulations have changed because they now provide two important tools of inquiry. Molecular simulations are important to both look at the behavior of experimental systems, but also as a way to validate theories, because at the end of the day, in the development of process systems, of design, you need analytical expressions, which is another word for theories, and that we cannot simulate, we cannot make molecular simulations for each individual conditions. So development of the theories is also very important. It is an additional approach to molecular simulations. Now, this is a graphic or timeline that I usually show to students in my molecular thermodynamics class, simply to illustrate many different contributions that happened over the last 150 years, I would say, in the field of molecular thermodynamics that eventually led to molecular simulations and computational chemistry as well. This is, of course, a very subjective list, because there are so many more people who contributed to this area of science. And I'm not going to go through this list in detail, but broadly, I would like to, let's say, split it into 4 domains. Development of theories and the fundamentals of statistical mechanics associated with the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and names such as Gibbs, Boltzmann, Maxwell in Edinburgh, and van der Waals. With the advance of quantum mechanics and very sophisticated experimentation, the beginning of the 20th century is associated with much better understanding of the structure of the atom and how atom and molecules interact with each other. And so the names of Lewis and Leonard Johns come into this domain, phase 2. And then with the advance of the computers, development of the molecular dynamics methods by Benny Adler and Monte Carlo methods by Nicholas Mitropoulos and co-workers. This is the era of computer simulations, phase 3 or stage 3. And then John Popple and Kohn, the ability to do quantum mechanical calculations on the computer. This is, let's say, stage 4 of this process. And now we live in stage 5, using machine learning to effectively uncover the potential and knowledge hidden in the already accumulated data and models. Now, for those of you curious about history, before the computers, you would have to use some kind of analog of your model. So for simulation of hard spheres, you probably could use a box full of ping pong balls, and you could look at the structure of them and how they behave. And this is not just a joke. It's really actual models that people would have to use as practical models before the advance of computer simulations. But late 50s, we now have molecular dynamics, and this is how computer storage would look like. This is how computer would look like, and this is how the code would look like. So this is very different from what we have now, where probably your phone has a computational power many thousand times more than these early computers in the 50s. And molecular dynamics is also, it's a very intuitive technique to understand. So I like to use it simply to explain what molecular simulations are. You simply need some kind of potential, which describes how molecules interact with each other. And then molecules follow that potential, they collide, they have forces acting on each other. And what you have is these molecular trajectories that you can interpret and obtain properties related to pressure, structure, interaction, and other properties of the system you might be interested in. And that is, in a nutshell, molecular dynamics as an example of a molecular simulation method. Okay, now I go to the question that I posed at the beginning of my talk. What it is you can do with molecular simulations. I already talked about chemical engineering and the growing role of that. In chemical engineering, molecular simulations are a replacement of experiments where maybe conditions are harsh, or maybe the components of the system are hazardous, explosive, or toxic, or maybe it is just too expensive to do these simulations. But actually, you know, as I go through the slide, I realize that things are changing. It's not just now a replacement or some kind of cheap replacement of the experiments. It is simply a completely new and powerful tool of scientific inquiry that actually can make our experimental program much more efficient and uncover fundamental physics on molecular level, why things interact in a particular level, and how this manifests in macroscopic thermophysical behavior. And that can be used in many areas of engineering, such as physics related to phase equilibrium, gas solubility, adsorption phenomena, transport, and so on. I'm not going to iterate all of this now, simply because I want to cover other topics in my presentation, but simply to understand what problems we can solve with molecular simulations. I encourage everyone in this seminar to go at the previous program of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers annual conference and simply see how many topics are related to so-called computational forum of this conference to understand that it is now a very integral part of chemical engineering science. Okay, and we also progressively see the synergy between simulations done at different levels. Here I'm using just an example to illustrate how these multi-scale simulations allow us to go from one level to another using adsorption problems. So in adsorption problem, one can envision that we first are interested in, for example, obtaining partial charges on the structure of a porous material, such as this Metalorganic framework. This quantum mechanical calibration of the models is required as data to be passed on the next level of atomistic molecular simulations, where we're interested in adsorption and diffusion properties on microscopic level. This is an example of the adsorption isotherms. And then this equilibrium data can be passed on to the process modeling, where we looked at the behavior of a material in the actual process, such as carbon capture, and that together forms this multi-scale simulation framework that goes from angstrom level to plant level scale. So I speculate that there's going to be further emergence of this multi-scale work flows for the actual process design in chemical engineering. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a slightly critical view of molecular simulations. like any tool in chemistry or in physics, it is a sophisticated tool. And to use it correctly, you need to have certain expertise. Otherwise, you will have a situation of garbage in, garbage out, where you don't know how to use a technique, and you don't know how to interpret the data that you get out of that. This is true for any type of instrumentation. Take mass spectrometry in chemistry, same problem. So it is important to ask correct questions, and it is important to understand how to interpret results, what it is you really see. And then the other challenge that I would like to pose is that the advances in software made setting up simulations quite easy. And also, because of this reason, tempting to set up simulations that would somehow replicate the system of interest. How many times I would have the experimentalists or groups approaching me proposing, can we simply simulate the system? And my answer to this type of proposals would always be, what is the question that you want to ask? Simply simulating it just because you can is not exactly good science or good practice. It is important to think about questions that you want to ask with your molecular simulation. And there's other alternatives. Not every question has to be answered by molecular simulations. You have classical density functional theories to understand adsorption problems. You have statistical association fluid theory to answer fluid phase equilibria, solubility problems. You can have phenomenological models as well. And what I would like to do now is simply have a little bit of a creativity exercise. I'm going to be deliberately not very precise and not very rigorous, but I would like to explore together with you how interesting physical phenomena can be studied using very, very simple toy models and things that we can learn from that. This is just a creativity exercise. And the case studies that I would like to share with you and talk about in a very non-scientific way are related to flexibility of crystals, such as metal organic frameworks. And really briefly, this is a relatively new class of materials. They are assembled in a solution from building blocks, such as metal organic complexes and some organic linkers. I'm just showing here one examples of these materials from very early studies. This was one of the first materials discovered. These materials are crystalline. They quite often have very low density and high surface area. And they have a fascinating diversity of the properties because you can simply change these properties by changing what building blocks you use. But also because you have this tinker toy model of these materials, you can imagine that by simply varying the building blocks that you use, you can tap in this arsenal of organic chemistry to build your materials. The number of possible MOFs is very large. This is a snapshot. It's a graph that I borrowed from this paper by David Farran Jimenez and co-workers that shows how many metal-organic frameworks have been reported in Cambridge structural database. And it is about, well, this is outdated figure. It's about 80,000 MOFs, about 10,000 of them are porous. And this is our only materials that have been already synthesized and already reported. But if you look at the template for making these materials, you can imagine that in principle, much larger number of materials that follow the structure can exist. And we can talk about these hypothetical MOFs that have not been yet synthesized, but we can imagine that they exist. And some of these materials are very interesting in their structure. Here I'm showing just a few examples to illustrate the structural diversity of these materials. They also have very interesting and fascinating properties. The specific one that I would like to talk about is this flexibility. Basically, depending on stimulus, temperature, or adsorption or pressure or combination of those, this material can really expand and shrink. For example, this breathing mill 47 can change its structure from narrow pore structure to wide pore structure shown here, and it changes its volume and sizes of the pore significantly. Another material is mill 88, as shown here, that upon adsorption can significantly expand and shrink its structure, and this is just a very fascinating phenomenon. So the question is how to explain it, why it is happening, how can we exploit it in various applications, and what actually the reasons for it to happen. Now, what I'm going to do is not going to compete with very rigorous approaches that are now available to describe these materials. And these approaches take a number of angles. They are based on thermodynamics, maybe mechanical view by Nymark and co-workers. Classical molecular simulations have been already applied to look at these flexible systems. And even quantum mechanical calculations are now being used to look at flexibility of porous materials, such as Morse and why it happens. And I'm not going to compete with these approaches. I'm going to rather complement them and take a slightly different angle. And the scientific question that I want to ask is whether it is possible to say if morph is flexible or not, simply by looking at its topology, how different things are connected to each other. Okay, so that's going to be my scientific question. Now, from the topological point of view, these materials made from secondary building units, they're made from these metal organic clusters as shown here, these guys, and then they're somehow connected by linkers. So if we replace these clusters with simply polyhedra that represents their shapes, and then the linkers we're simply going to replace by, let's say, this type of bond, just a rod of sorts, then we can reduce the structure of these metal organic frameworks to their bare topology as shown here. And that is very useful to really understand what is the underlying net, the underlying architecture of these materials. It is useful to classify them. It is useful to understand what kind of materials we can synthesize if we keep the net the same, but we change the building blocks. And it is also very important simply for fundamental science. The question would be, how many different topologies are out there? And that is a fundamental topological question. Now, unfortunately, these topologies are too simplistic to describe the mechanical behavior of these materials. And the reason for this, because the way how these topological elements are linked to each other contains no information about the mechanical behavior at their junctions. And if we want to describe mechanics of metal organic frameworks, we need to incorporate that information about the mechanics of the junctions in the picture. Let's take a look at this. So this is a little bit more of a chemistry exploration. We looked at how different organic linkers are attached to metal organic complexes. So this can be seen as a vertex. And this is this carboxylic linker that is attached to the metal complex. Two things that I want to say about this. A, individual building blocks overall seem to me rather rigid. They're not that super flexible. There's not that much that these building blocks can do. And then the other thing that I want to mention is exactly where these two building blocks meet each other. Because where they meet, they form what in mechanical engineering is known as a hinge. If you look now at my screen, not at the presentation, what I'm trying to say is that these two building blocks cannot rotate in any degree as possible, but as a hinge, they can rotate only along a particular axis. And that constrains the rotations that these linkers can experience with respect to the vertices. They can rotate only in one particular plane. And if we want to describe the flexibility or rigidity of this class of metalorganic frameworks based specifically, for example, on carboxylic linkers, we want to incorporate this hinge rotation as shown here into our mechanical models. Now, how do you do that? Do you do this using molecular simulations, quantum mechanical theories, something else? That's a question. No, what you do, these are basically the questions that I wanted to ask, but I already alluded that this is what I wanted to do. We want to incorporate this hinge rotation into our mechanical description of these materials. And we want to have a quick algorithms that would tell us whether MOFs are flexible or not. So the first thing that you want to do, or this is what I did, I went to a shop, actually kind of a B&Q, but I did it in the States. I don't remember what it was called. I think it was called Ace or something like this. And I bought simply pieces of wood as shown here. I bought furniture hinges as shown here. I bought some paint, and I had a really fun weekend building wood block representations of metal organic frameworks connected with furniture hinges. That's what my sabbatical at University of Berkeley was about. Now, it's really kind of fascinating what happened about this, because what I'm showing here is, this is a picture of an actual wooden model that I built that has this metal organic blocks here connected by linkers. And these are the linkers representing carboxylic molecules. And what you can see even from the structure of this molecule is that these linkers are connected by these furniture hinges at an angle. This model was remaining very floppy and flexible till I glued together the final linker. And at the moment when that happened, the structure became rigid. And the reason for this is because that if you look at these building blocks and hinges, they are all located in mutually exclusive rotation planes. And that leads to locking their degrees of freedom and the structure being overall rigid. And that is a simple mechanical explanation why IRMOF1 is overall a rigid structure. It has, of course, some local, expansion and contraction, but it's not flexible in a sense of MIL88 material or MIL47. So I build a lot of these models, and the problem with this is, of course, you cannot use these models for computational screening. And we wanted to have an algorithm that would work on a computer. So the next step would try to understand how these concepts would be translated in the language of computer algorithms. And so a couple of approaches that we could use. So if you wanted to mathematically, let's say, formulate these problems, in mechanical engineering, there's a number of approaches based on accurate calculation of degrees of freedom available in the mechanisms. And there's a lot of very fundamental theories about this, and we've tried in the early attempts to apply degrees of freedom analysis, such as Chebyshev, Grubler, Kutzbach criterion for degrees of freedom in mechanisms, and that proved to be not very promising. I'm not going to go in detail of that. There's also a significant body of knowledge accumulated within the so-called rigidity theory approaches based on the concepts of graphs, rigidity metrics, pebble game algorithms that have been used in understanding the flexibility of zeolites and window of flexibility on zeolites. and I refer the audience to the articles by Thorpe and co-workers from Arizona State University, who have done a lot of very fascinating and fundamental studies on application of the rigidity theory to proteins and to zeolites, this type of structures. What I would like to do is I would like to tap and diverge into another field of engineering, specifically civil engineering. And in civil engineering, if mechanical engineers are interested in the mechanisms that move relative parts with respect to each other, in civil engineering, you don't really want parts of the bridges to move. So civil engineers are interested in how to make things fixed. And one particular very important element in civil engineering is so-called truss. Truss is an element of civil engineering, which can be seen simply as three metal bars forged or glued to each other, obviously forming a very stable structure shown here. And of course, elements like these trusses have been used in all kinds of construction works to make sure that they have structural and mechanical stability. So for those of you who are spending their lockdown period in Edinburgh, you will, of course, know the Firth of Forth classical bridge from the Victorian times that, as you can see, is made out of elements such as the trusses, and this picture is demonstrating how stable the structure is with the engineers posing on the model of the bridge as shown here. So then let's use this concept. So the basic idea is, why don't we use some kind of algorithms that will tell us all the atoms in the structure of our Metalorganic frameworks that form definitely rigorous elements, and everything else is going to be somehow flexible. So then the algorithm is to take the structure of the Metalorganic framework and parse it into a system of what we called molecular trusses. This would be a rigid structure because it is a system of molecular trusses. And this would be a structure because it is also a system, the basic, simplest system of molecular trusses representing this linker. These elements combined together form a hinge where they're connected. And this is molecular truss representation of the IRMOF1 material. Now, what we can do now, we can see whether our theory works or not, simply by taking the structure and exposing it to all kinds of deformations. And basically, we want to understand, can we break it or not? If it breaks, somehow it must be flexible. If it resists up to a point, it must be rigid. And maybe we can use this algorithm to classify materials into broadly flexible and broadly rigid. And of course, you can use all kinds of mechanical tests to see if your structure is flexible or not. I'm just going to show one example. This is for MIL47. That is the example of a flexible structure that I showed at the beginning. And you can see this red line corresponds to essentially having no energy penalty if we want to squeeze this material in this direction. However, if you try to use some other deformations, the system responds very quickly by telling you essentially, no, don't squeeze me in this direction because that will cost me a lot of grief and energy penalty. And as you can see, this little GIF video shown here shows how molecular truss system deforms upon squeezing it in this direction. Similar analysis can be done for MIL88, where this is the mechanical model of MIL88, and this is molecular truss or civil engineering model of this material. And again, we were able to detect different flexibility modes that are broadly in agreement with what has been observed in experiments using a very simplistic representation of the structure. There is no molecular interactions. Now, the benefit of models like this is not just in explaining why material behave in a particular way, but also an ability to maybe classify and predict what materials should do. So we applied this molecular truss theory to a number of materials, classifying them into flexible and rigid, and it is just a way to think about these large groups of materials and see analogies in their structure and what really is responsible for their flexibilities. And this type of ideas, although they're very simplistic in a sense, they are powerful because they can also influence other areas of research and allow us to move forward. So this work has been done several years ago. We published it in JACS in 2014. And then what happened is that it influenced other work and collaboration that I've done with the group of Beren Smith at EPFL. And in particular, Muhammad Musavi, now Dr. Musavi, has applied some of these ideas to understand the flexibility and mechanical properties of ZIF materials. So this is essentially a cloud of ZIF materials that feature different side groups. And what is interesting about these clouds of materials is that they actually show very different mechanical properties that is not quite easy to say intuitively once some of the materials are very soft and some of the materials are actually quite rigid, although they have low density. And following from the mechanical analysis that we presented many years ago, Muhammad came up with a very bright idea. He basically said, what if we decouple these two phenomena? What if we simply look at intrinsic rigidity of just the framework, so intermolecular interactions, all the bonds, bending, connections that are characteristic for the framework. And this is the mechanical response that he received. So actually, all the frameworks, they kind of fall into one cloud of structures. And then, what if you add back the non-bonded interactions? This is all the dispersion van der Waals and electrostatic interactions that exist between atoms within the structure. And it turns out that when you add these non-bonded interactions back into your model, you have these clouds separating, representing very diverse mechanical behavior. So somehow this diversity of clouds is linked to how atoms interact with each other within the structure via non-bonded dispersive interactions that are not necessarily part of the backbone. And that is very fascinating. So what would be the reason for why this type of diversification of the interactions happened? And I'm not going to go into all of these details, but basically the phenomena that Muhammad managed to discover is that depending on the structure of the material and depending on the side groups, in some of the materials, atoms of the material are able to form the networks of non-bonded interactions that actually act reinforcing the mechanical stability, the stiffness of these materials. And some of these networks are visualized here for some of the materials. So one can see these frameworks as essentially these structural supports that hold the structure and make it mechanically much more rigid than what would be expected based on the topology of the network alone. And that phenomena was called chemical caryatids. because obviously this is the only way to publish articles in prestigious journals. So you have to come up with a really cool name for the phenomena that you discover. Okay. Now, in the final few slides, I would like to use another example, and I can already see that I am somewhat running out of time, so I may skip some of the technical derivations that I had in the slides, but I would like to focus on another phenomena that is associated with adsorption in metalorganic frameworks, and a particular phenomena of negative adsorption in porous materials. Now, what is negative adsorption? First of all, adsorption isotherm simply shows the amount adsorbed as a function of pressure. And this is the isotherm that is shown here. All materials, according to the classical thermodynamics of adsorption, should exhibit positive adsorption as a function of pressure, meaning that the amount adsorbed cannot diminish as you increase pressure. This is just the thermodynamic consistency constraint that cannot be violated. Okay, and then several years ago, the group of Stefan Kaskel synthesized a very large pore material called DUT47. So the pores are 1 nanometer, 1.7 nanometer, and 2.4 nanometer, so very large pores for this type of materials. And on the adsorption isotherms, they observed this little kink that showed negative adsorption. It went down. So you can imagine that for a very sharp experimentalist, this drives them completely crazy, because they repeated this experiment many times on many different conditions. Simon Krause was extremely diligent in doing it again and again and again, and looking at all kinds of different additional experimental techniques that would allow him to get rid of it. But it stayed. This little step stayed. And after several years of investigation, after several years of trying different species, different conditions, it is now clear that this is a real physical phenomena. It's not going to go away. And it is associated with these very porous structures being flexible, somehow reaching metastable state, collapsing, and the collapse of the structure would lead to such a change in the volume that some of the adsorbed material would be expelled and released. And that leads to this negative adsorption step. So the question is how to explain it. This is what I already kind of alluded to, that this is the collapse that happens when you have this structure going through the adsorption process. And this is where this collapse happens. Now, there's a lot of studies of this, and Francois Xavier-Coudet and Jack Evans, they had a very nice paper, very rigorous paper that looked at free energy landscape of this type of systems and how the system goes from one energy minima to another and why it happens, and it is done using molecular simulations, and it is indeed very rigorous and very systematic. This is my model. I'm not going to do any complicated molecular simulations. I'm going to get away with something really, really simple. And my model is two walls attached to a spring. And I would like to understand whether I can explain everything using this model. Why would I believe that this model can explain this complex phenomena at all? What kind of mechanism exactly I am proposing for this system to exhibit? And this is the idea. So first of all, I'm not building on something that has not been studied before. This type of simple models with flexible structures have been studied by many other colleagues. And of course, I take a lot of inspiration from my peers, such as Alex Nymark and his group, but also the group of Numaguchi in Japan. They were pioneers in developing this type of models. And the basic idea would be that at the beginning, you have this slit pore with some fluid accumulating on the walls. This is the adsorption isotherm. The spring holds the walls together. As the simulation progresses, the liquid on the side of the walls kind of starts filling each other, but some barrier is preventing it from actually reaching each other, but they see the van der Waals interaction of each other. So they reach this point over here on the isotherm, and then at some point they cannot resist their attraction anymore. They collide, and that is shown here. The spring stretches. It is a very narrow pore now. It maybe releases some of the material. It corresponds to this negative jump on the isotherm here. And then as you increase the adsorption process, increase pressure, at some point, of course, the adsorbing fluid has to go in somewhere. So the pore must expand again and accommodate more material, leading to expected increase of the adsorbed amount as you increase pressure. So this is the model, and what we wanted to do is to develop a simple theoretical framework to study under what conditions the negative adsorption happens. Is it a frequent phenomena or is it a rare phenomena? And investigate this in detail. Now, because I'm running out of time, I'm going to actually skip most of the theoretical details and go maybe only to the one final result. And this result is as follows. The thermodynamic stability of the systems is described by the osmotic potential, as shown, if I can have my mouse back. The osmotic potential is shown here. Using mean field approaches, you can factorize this osmotic potential in the free energy contribution of the host, and in our case, it would be the spring, in the PV term, which is actually not that important, it's not that big, and into the grand potential contribution that is corresponding to each individual size of the pore and can be obtained from some classical methods. And in this case, your analysis is very simple. You generate a very large number of the adsorption isotherms for pores of different widths. For each of those, you obtain grand potential as a function of temperature, pressure, and then this grand potential will be for different widths of the pores here, because these are different fixed slit pores. You overimpose the grand potential with the Helmholtz free energy of the spring. That should give you the profile of the free energy in the system that will tell you which widths corresponds to the most stable state of the system. Okay, and in this case, you can see your system as wandering on that free energy landscape, telling you which width of the system is the most stable at what point on the pressure isotherm. And the beauty of dealing or working with the slit pore models is that you can use very computationally efficient methods, such as density functional theory, classical density functional theory, to obtain a large number of the isotherms. Now, I want to leave some time for the questions, so I will go straight to the results to show that effectively using these methods, we can very quickly, computationally quickly, scan very large number of conditions and answer, for example, questions such as what kind of free energy profile should a spring have in order for the system to exhibit negative adsorption phenomena, and what kind of springs will induce metastability required for this to happen. And you can quickly map all properties or all conditions under which this negative adsorption can happen. Okay. Finally, I will conclude my presentation by simply stating what it is I'm working on now, and this is related to asking a very basic question. If we collect all the data, all the papers that have been published on synthesis of MOFs, can we actually transform it into digital knowledge, codify it, and in this case, can we actually explore the hidden properties in the structures to understand where undiscovered materials exist and where undiscovered synthetic conditions exist. And with this kind of provocative but brief message, I would like to thank Dmitry for organizing this seminar, and I would like to thank everyone for your attention. Although I don't see your faces, I would like to thank everyone for coming.
Thank you, Lev. We have several questions. The first question is from Miguel Josh. Your models describe the unit cell, but most are 3D periodic structures. Did you find any examples where the unit cell was flexible, but the extended periodic structure was rigid?
It is a very good question, and a very fundamental one, in the sense that the structures that may be flexible at the level of the unit cell may not necessarily be flexible when you put them in the crystal. And also what I want to comment, I'm just thinking out loud about this question, buying myself a bit more time. Of course, the fact that it is collective phenomena has been studied by Nymark and co-worker. And my answer would be like this. If the unit cell is rigid, the structure is going to be rigid in periodic boundary conditions. If the unit cell is flexible, the structure may or may not be flexible in periodic boundary conditions. And that's where I'm going to leave it.
Okay. The next question comes from YouTube. Sagar Patil asks, what are the basic softwares for computational chemistry?
Right. So it all depends on what it is you want to do. There is a number of softwares that are available for molecular dynamics, such as GROMACS, LAMS, VMD, and AMD. The situation is much more murky when it comes to Monte Carlo simulations, where there's only, at the moment, 1 or 2 freely available codes, such as RASPA, to do Monte Carlo simulations, which is relevant for the adsorption problems. And then, of course, in the field of computational chemistry, there's a huge variety of codes, both commercial and freely available, that have different type of capabilities. And the last time I simply Googled computational chemistry software, it gave me on Wikipedia a very comprehensive matrix of both packages, capabilities, and availability, whether it is commercial or open source or freely available. And I would recommend that this would be a good starting point for computational chemistry that is related to quantum mechanical calculations, ab initio calculations.
Okay, the next question comes from Sebastian Amaya. How did you calculate the adsorption isotherm at the last part of the presentation? With Monte Carlo?
No, it's a very good question, and that I think is the point that I was trying to make, that because we are using a slit pore model for this type of simple geometries, we can use classical density functional theory. Please do not confuse it with ab initio density functional theory that is used for energy minimization and some other electronic structure calculations. This is a classical density functional theory. That means that it looks at molecules interacting with each other with Lennard-Jones potential, classical potentials. This theory allows you to calculate properties similar to Monte Carlo simulations, such as adsorption isotherms, but it is about 2 orders, if not more, computationally more efficient than Monte Carlo simulations. And the particular model and the code that we've been using have been developed by my collaborator, Martin Sweatman, and this is the publication to the paper, the reference to the publication.
Okay, Sebastian, it seems like he clarifies that and asks, so that the DFT was used to calculate which property of the pore or MOF in your presentation.
The DFT was used to calculate adsorption loading, and because it is a theory, from DFT you also have a direct calculation of the grand potential as a function of pressure. So these are two main properties used for obtained from DFT. Isotherms like this, and for each point on the isotherm, it provides an explicit value of the grand potential, which then, of course, makes this calculation very easy, because then you simply combine these different terms together.
Okay. The next question comes from Alina Yemelyanova. Can the presented model based on the osmotic potential predict not just the isotherm, but also the strains in MOFs during adsorptions?
Sorry, in MOFs, what is in MOFs?
But also the strains.
This is a very good question. It is very nice. In principle, the strain can be obtained in these models, but I would not use it for an application to MOFs. At the end of the day, this model is based on very simple representation of your porous material as just a slit pore with two walls. And this is just so that you can explore very quickly a large number of conditions and phenomena. The MOFs are peculiar in the sense that their properties are quite sensitive to their structure. And so from that point of view, I would say that specific properties of a MOF, such as strain, for this you need to use the actual model of a MOF, of your specific MOF. But for that type of science, FX Couder and other people working in this field have already published quite an extensive data and articles on how to do that using more sophisticated molecular simulation methods and force fields.
Another question comes from Maria Grazia de Angeles. So it contains a comment and I think like a question. Correlations for mechanical properties in MOFs. Is there any similarity with polymers? Non-bonded interaction increase the modulus also in polymers, maybe?
All right. Buongiorno, grazie. I'm glad you made it. Very good. I think it is a fantastic question. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I think it's a very good question to investigate.
Okay. Give me a moment.
Mm-hmm.
A question from Hamut Yu. How to benefit that knowledge in industry?
It's a very good question, and to a significant extent, the whole symposium is about that. So let me give you just one example, going back to the flexibility of porous materials. I'll go back to maybe this slide here, where basically what you can do is the practical outcome of this is that using very simple guiding principles on the mechanical criteria for having flexibility in MOFs or not, you can actually look for it. you can either synthesize materials following this criteria and engineer it to be flexible, or vice versa. You can design materials and synthesize them to be more rigid by making sure that you avoid conditions and criteria that lead to its flexibility. And that is in fact, very practical guidance and outcome for the, let's say, synthetic chemists, practitioners of developing materials. Now, between the crystal synthesized in the lab and actual industrial application, there is still a very significant gap. But this, that's a gradual process. You first want to understand what materials you want to use, and then you want to understand how to scale up their productions. But you can start by engineering the mechanical response properties using molecular principles as summarized in this table.
Okay. Lev, since you are here on this slide, I think I have my question, and I think it's related to this slide. If you have the same linker, but different metal sites, thus changing intermolecular interactions that you described. So can we still predict more flexibility?
I would say I would pose it around. If you have the same metal vertex or metal coordination site, but you change the linkers, you make them longer. These mechanical models do not have any variable that describes the length of the linker. This flexibility is invariant to the length of the linker because it's based just on the topology. So within this mechanical model, we say that all the materials that follow this topology should have the same overall flexibility phenomena. However, of course, that effectively works up to a point, because obviously if the linkers become too long, too floppy, or too flexible, then it's not going to apply anymore.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Roberta Yanito. Are there works concerned about negative gas absorption in presence of multi-component mixtures?
Yes. There are several studies that look at broad phase diagram of the flexibility of materials with respect to mixtures. And again, I would refer Roberto to articles from FX Scuder on this that has been investigated. Yeah. Dmitry, if I may suggest, one possibility would be to actually collect the questions that ask for specific information or follow-up papers, so I can reply to them with the references, and then maybe we can post it somewhere on the website or send it as a link to participants.
Okay, this could be an option. Roberta continues, does the desorption branch of materials with negative gas absorption show transition between stable and metastable states?
So, if I can, so on the desorption branch, this line in principle should go slightly above the red, and then there is a metastable transition back. So there's some metastability here as well, if this is what you are asking, Roberta.
Okay. There is another question from Zoom, from Pejman. Regarding the negative gas absorption and considering a case that we keep the framework rigid, if we observe such phenomena within our simulations, can it still be considered as negative gas absorption, or flexibility is a must in this case?
Well, the negative gas absorption can happen only in flexible structures. And it can happen only in certain flexible structures that exhibit bistable free energy profile associated with their free energy transitions of their structure. So these two things cannot be separated as such. You cannot have negative adsorption, negative absolute adsorption to be precise. I'm not talking about excess adsorption. You cannot have negative absolute adsorption unless your structure is flexible, and flexible according to certain criteria as well. Yeah, if I understood the question correctly.
Okay, thank you, Lev. I think we do not have questions anymore. So you can stop your demonstration. Okay. Thank you, Lev.
I thank you very much, everyone.
Our next speaker is Dr. Valentina Erastova. Valentina is a Chancellor's Fellow in the School of Chemistry at the University of Edinburgh. Her research interests include the development of molecular modeling techniques for the study of minerals, materials, and interactions at the interfaces. Among her contributions is assemble software to prepare molecular dynamics simulations of polymeric systems, and just give me a moment, and molecular modeling techniques for solid state NMR. So now I would like to give a word to Valentina.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me over to give this talk to you all. And unfortunately, we all have to be locked away in our homes, but it's a great opportunity to still talk about science and share some ideas. So 1 second, I'm just working this out. I'm just sharing full screen, right, with you? Yep. So is this, do you see what, do you see everything correctly?
Yes, it works. It works. We can see a presentation.
Perfect. Right. Thank you very much. So I will talk to you about some of my work done, and it is focused on modeling dynamical processes that occur in solids, and very often it is soils. So I'm a bit crazy about clays, and if anyone is interested, you can chat with me forever about them. They're very, very interesting materials we have, and they've got a lot of properties in our life. And if it's driven, a lot of things are dependent on that. So, so you had already a few talks before that explained to you molecular modeling, and there will be some more later on. And what it is basically a theoretical computational technique that allows us to see how the molecules behave, what properties they have under certain conditions. We would normally do this when we cannot measure something experimentally. Either it's expensive, time-consuming, dangerous, or we're sitting in a COVID lockdown. Be very careful with this one. And also, it allows us to be predictive analytical tool sometimes to see if it's worth even trying to run a simulation, to run an experiment. And so I'm just going to hide this somehow. And one of these examples is enhanced oil recovery that you'll see a picture from the field on the left, and correlated next to this is our molecular model. It allows us to see it very, very fine atomistic detail. Sorry, this was happening. I have a pet cow. So that allows us to rationalize experiments and see what happens at the optimistic level. So to be able to run the simulations, as Lev already described really well before, you have to have a hypothesis and, sorry, 1 second, that you have to have a hypothesis that you want to try, and you have and be able to run the simulations. You have to have an engine, and you have to have a computer. You have to put into it some information, some laws of physics you have to obey, a hypothesis, experimental observables, and some sort of previous knowledge that you're basing your model upon. Then you build a model, and you would like this model to be able to explain something you already know, but not in full enough detail, something that you'd like to find out more about. So here within this talk, I'll show you some of the examples where we have used molecular modeling to explain different phenomena that we're observing experimentally, or we've used it for studying something we have not been able to study experimentally. So there are some topics within here, and I'll briefly discuss them. So this first one is enhanced oil recovery. Since it was on the first slide, it all started with my PhD that I did in Durham, and it was based for, I was looking at the additives into diesel fuel for preventing of the crystal formation within the engine. While it is a very, it's been a few years ago, and computers weren't as good then. So crystallization is a very slow process. And it's quite difficult to study it on just with molecular dynamics due to timescales and the slow motions. So here I worked with coarse graining, and we're able to develop a coarse grained force field able to produce crystallization. Then from that, with the knowledge about oils, I went into the earth sciences and worked on modeling of enhanced oil recovery. So oil is our natural resource that sits in the ground, and our ability to recover oil from the ground is dependent upon type of the oil. So what are molecular components of it, and what are the salinity and what are the clay systems around. So here you can see clays surrounding the little oil well, in the oil well, with a pore that would be flooded with water, and that would allow to recover some extra amount of oil. And here you'll see how in calcium chloride system versus sodium chloride, calcium chloride system would keep the oil very well absorbed, when sodium chloride would allow it to be desorbing off this nanopore. This process can be responsible for recovery up to 5% of the oil. So another good thing about molecular modeling, that it gives us information about atomistic interactions, and we can see what actually is the process that allows us this extra recovery. And upon of that, we can then try to improve it somehow. So this is just comparison of another clay system that could be present, very common around the oil wells. And again, here we can look in the details of those interactions. So how this droplet of oil surrounded by water, so water is not shown in this nanopore. This is kaolinite, will be sitting. Kaolinite is a very interesting clay. So let me see if I can find the cursor. I've got a hydrophobic surface on one side and a hydrophilic on another. And here's water, here is oil part. So oil would be a very difficult one to remove. When we change salinity and the protonation, we can remove again this oil fraction. So knowing the pH of the system, and we can choose what kind of oil, what kind of water to pump into the system, which ions enriching could be useful, or if there are some other additives we could be using. This is just, again, an example of different oil components and different clays. Other ways of studying it in even greater detail, this interactions of soils with water, because we always have got a bit of water in the soils and a bit of ions, would be through a very detailed potential of mean force calculation, where we can pull, I think this would be discussed in more detail further on through the seminars. But here we can pull and push this ion, this little blue ion here, into the surface and away from the surface, and find out great details about the interaction of this ion. So here we're rebuilding this curve. This is the energy profile curve, telling us where this sodium ion, in this case, is likely to be sitting with respect to the clay surface that's here. This is again interesting because we can then find out at the hydration of those sodium ions with water and what is the hydration shell. That again gives us information about how mobile would be those ions, and if we have got other components absorbed over them, as in previous slides, for example, how well we could push it away. So we've done this for a variety of common ions present in our soils, and obtained this plots that are showing us ions at different distance away from the surface, and how is the water hydration shell is forming around them. It is also interesting here because from knowledge upon this adsorption and the energetics of it, we can see if some ions are exchangeable. So for example, if we've got an ion that is holding oil fraction really well in place, would we be able to exchange it for an ion that would be capable of allowing this oil to desorb? So here is again the positions of those ions over the clay siloxane surface, hydrophobic surface. And we can again see how the closed cesium, for example, is sitting very well inside the clays. And this is actually very interesting for nuclear waste disposal, when ions like cesium that we don't really want to be escaping from our disposal site would be very well retained by clays. So clays are used as an outer coating for those disposals. From that, we have then modeled very complex, very heavy, slow moving oil that is present in China, that gave us a lot of components of it that are given here, and two types of clay surfaces would give a very different adsorption patterns. So on one of them, the hydrophobic one, oils would be absorbed and well aligned and very immobile, when on other ones, they would be just touching a little bit onto the surface and would be much easier to desorb. And this is just decomposition of the previous picture. This also led to the software Dinden that allows us to see if we are able to model the system we're modeling, if it is converged and representative of a realistic system of the oil well that obviously formed after really long geological times. This is something where you have to be always very careful that our model is representative of the phenomenon we would like to be explaining. So from that, another example is an industrial application. I'll just really quickly overview that. So the problem was there is this lead double hydroxide, and they're fantastic materials because we can make them very easily in the lab. But making them in the lab under normal conditions with CO2 in the air present would lead to this very clunky crystals. There is a treatment by O'Hare's lab in Oxford with organic solvent. It was called originally Access miscible organic solvent treatment that allows to flake it up, creating a very high surface material that can then be used as a catalytic surface or as then or later on transformed to mixed metal oxides, etc. Or adsorbents. There's plenty of usages of that. Unfortunately, one of the best solvents here was acetone that's very flammable and very difficult to handle in industrial scales. So they were looking for something else. We've approached it by just sampling everything that's good versus everything that's bad and running some simulations, looking at different profiles of where the molecules would be sitting, how they would be aligning, trying to understand what would make it good and bad. And on the first idea was that indeed it was a miscible organic solvent, and we looked at how those interactions of the solvent would allow for this fluffing up of this elimination of this very accumulated lead hydroxide. Then was a bit more of looking and trying. We realized that actually it wasn't always the miscible organic solvent, but the descriptors of the solvent that would work were very often associated to it being miscible. So that just led to a pretty picture. That's always very important to have and to make. The other part of modeling this slow system and solids. So we'll deviate a little bit now from clays and just quickly look at modeling of dynamics in proper solids, so proper crystals. This is diamondoids. They are this beautiful little cages. And if you look at this crystal, well, the solid, and by eye, they're very, very rigid and solid. Nevertheless, there's motion occurring in there. This motion has been very difficult to explain through the various studies. So the motion you're seeing now was explained very early by NMR. But what happens here, this is a C3 rotation, as you were seeing. So it just rotates along the C3 axis at 12 nanoseconds, and we can observe it through MD very easily and through solid state NMR. Great. So I've done some principal component analysis and could represent space really well here. Very good agreement as well with experiments and the time scale. The question then went into what happens when you heat it up, because at that point, solid state NMR could no longer explain this phenomenon. With the models and analysis that we've created, we could see that those, so the bands before for the C3 were like 3 main wells where it would be kind of sitting in this reduced representation. When we heat it up, we're seeing 4 bands with 3 wells each. And that, looking through it, so it was done through Markov states, we could see that within each band, at slightly higher temperature, we were indeed still seeing this C3 rotation around 10 nanosecond time scales, while between the bands were quite rare events, but nevertheless, Markov states were letting us observe those on the simulations done over 400, 500 nanoseconds. We could see those rare flips could be described by through this model. Right. Now, the exciting part, as you have seen at the beginning of my talk, there was promises to talk about origins of life, and this is part of my interest. So let me tell you a little bit about it and where exactly I see computational chemistry has very strong power here to help us understand a lot of things we would very struggle otherwise. So origins of life happened somewhere on the time scale of our existence that we are aware of. So if the Big Bang was nearly 14 billion years ago, I mean, on the relative scale, and we're here, this is evidence of life on Earth. So just after formation of the planet, something happened here that turned geology to biology. And as a chemist, I believe it was, of course, chemistry. That was the key step in here. So from a chemist point of view, of course, this little process would be based upon, so we can get small organic molecules, so we can synthesize those. Then from there, we could go into polymers, because life as we know it is driven by polymers. Then there is some sort of emergence of self-replication, catalysis, and inheritance that are key properties of life. Formation of protobionts, so cell-like structures, and so on. And then it gets too biological for chemist mind, and I'm happy there. But we don't really understand this part of the origins of life. So we can get to small organic molecules, and from protobionts later on, I'm sure people will disagree, but we have some sort of root. Well, here it's not, it's a bit lost. So let's just have a look at what we know about life, because we always have to look at the life as we know it. And all we do is we have got last universal common ancestor, and that's our last trace of life on Earth. It has this key point, key descriptors of it. So there is information, replication, compartmentalization always, and energy. And all of those come together. And it's very difficult to say what came first. And in my view, it had to come together at some point very early on. So while I said it was this is our life on Earth, there's also possibility of extraterrestrial life, of course, happening before, or maybe at the same time. And we are now going onto space missions and spending a lot of money for those to see if we can find some traces of life elsewhere for habitability or for understanding where we came from and where life started. So here we're on Earth, and this is just an example of one of the studies that recently this year came out. I mean, all the studies I discuss now is very, very recent and very computationally driven. So this is just Earth, and this is polar clouds of water ice. And this is Titan, that's moon of Saturn. As you can see, it's quite far away from Sun. And so the water is frozen on top of it, but it's got methane polar clouds that look very similar to the ones on Earth. And actually, Titan is very interesting. It's a moon body. It's got 180 degrees C on top of the surface, so no surface water, but we do believe there is water underneath surface. It's a very dense atmosphere. There's a lot of organic molecules because of the there's a very thick because of the thickness of atmosphere and excited state chemistry happening there. It's absolutely very, very interesting from that perspective. There are seas of methane. It snows benzene. It must be absolutely beautiful, and it is from the pictures we have of it. And of course, it is becoming a playground for the origins of life ideas. And here is when computational chemistry and theoretical, I would say, chemistry comes into play. So in 2012, they were able to demonstrate in a lab that it's possible to form amino acids, so the key building blocks of proteins and also nucleotide bases, so of RNAs, in a simulated atmosphere of Titan. And this is interesting because it was done without liquid water that we thought was a key component to make those building blocks. Then, of course, that led to what else do we need to have life? And in 2015, autosomes have been suggested. So while our life is driven by cells that have got membranes, autosome is kind of a little membrane that could also have compartmentalization on Titan. And then very recently, another paper came out that that argued against the methods and observables of and approaches used in the previous paper, and they were both computational. And to be honest, if you were interested, go and read them both. And they're very well done, very solid computationally. But their argument was there that if it's possible or not possible. And this is one of the examples where computational chemistry can give us insights into whether we should be looking for something, we should be tracing something in the places where we cannot reach, should be sending space missions to look for what. And one of the main things is when going to Titan, we don't know even that much about it because we weren't prepared to see such a variety of organic molecules present there. So, so this was just a small discussion on compartmentalization that could be occurring on planets outside, and how computational models could give us some insights onto it. The other, of course, important parts of life as we know it is information and replication. And here I'm quite excited always about proteins, and there's always search for proteins in space, because we know we have amino acids and we can find them everywhere on meteorites, but can we have proteins? So quite recently, when news were not yet COVID, so it was March, this article was published in Archive. So let's not take it as an absolute, where they have suggested that they found a hemolysin type of protein kind of thing that you can see here on a meteorite that landed on Earth. They could show that it's not contamination from Earth due to the isotopes, and suggested this structure. There were reasons for suggesting it, and they're all described in the paper, so please do have a look at it if you're interested. Just a little bit earlier than that, there was another paper submitted again into ComECS, again finding protein peptide-like sequences on the meteorite, and again it was a meteorite on Earth. So the question is, I was surprised because there's a lot of noise about it. Oh my God, there are proteins in space. We must have life everywhere. So I can't answer this, but what I can tell you is that meteorites are very exciting for me, because they're solid and they have a lot of properties to them that could maybe make this formation of proteins very likely. So all of the meteorites that were used in the previous two studies were very organic rich. They had a lot of amino acids. They had a lot of insoluble molecules. They had kerogen. Kerogen is one of very heavy fractions of oil that actually prevents us from removing it. There were also some volatile organics and some water in all of those meteorites. That means that at all times, this meteorite remained below 200 degrees Celsius. And this is important for preservation of anything that could be lifelike. It also is full of silicates, oxides, and serpentine and olivine. And those two minerals are very interesting for me because they are related to what we believe could have been present at the core of formation of the first peptides or sequences. So I'll just have a very, very quick recap of what we know about peptides and minerals and how they come together. So Miller in 1952 shown us that it's possible to make amino acids, the building blocks, from a very primitive atmosphere of early Earth. At the same time, Bernal has suggested that clay minerals must have played a key role in chemical evolution of the life origin. 20 years, almost 30 years after, Karen Smith also suggested that maybe we shouldn't be looking for DNA or RNA to be able to enable life, but simple crystals and simple ordered structures of inorganic structures, crystals, could be acting like that DNA to preserve and replicate information. So if you think of the crystals, they're very ordered, but there are some imperfections that can be propagated. And depending on the conditions of their formation, they would have slightly different structures, features, substitutions. And that will cause some sort of inheritance of information. There's been a lot of arguments for and against, and I'm not going to go into that. But what we also know is that clay minerals, so the silicates, and why we're so excited about finding them as well on Mars, have been known from 1970s to be able to template the catalysis and asymmetric polymerization of amino acids. And this is very important, again, to what we're getting excited now in the news. Then there's a bit more oxide surfaces, again, self-assembly of very long oligomers, emergence of functional ensembles in chemical reactions by Leor Cronin last year. And all of this was happening with clay minerals present somewhere. What I haven't told you about statement of Bernal is what he said was that they indeed must have played a key role in the chemical evolution because the clays can concentrate, take up molecules, concentrate them, protect and catalyze the polymerization of organic molecules. And this is completely true. But here the word protect is important, because protection is when you keep this formed new molecule at the same place, so it's very strongly adsorbed. And indeed, collagen will be well preserved within the layers of clays, and we can still find these beautiful fossilized species that give us insights of what was happening on the planet when we weren't there yet. And interestingly here, this crazy protoprotein that was found has got a lot of glycines and hydroxyglycines. And hydroxyglycines are, so they believe they're holding those together. They are what we find in collagen that has been left for a really long time between the clays. So that hints me to the overprotection and preservation of the material that could have been formed before. And this is a very interesting discussion of preservation of a material versus habitability or enabling life. And this is just a very, very small diagram. And this discussion is again interesting for exploration and space missions. And if you do want to know more, this is a fantastic discussion here by Sean, who is in Edinburgh, of why we should be going to certain places on our missions to be able to look for fossil records, while not too far from where the origin of those, what would make fossils, could have started. So this brings us to energy, and energy here is something that would allow this light system to happen. And that energy would make those places habitable. So it will provide some catalyst and sort of drive for the reactions to occur until this life becomes completely self-sustaining and can walk away to wherever it will be preserved if we're lucky enough to ever find it on the missions. And one of those theories was hydrothermal vents by Martin and Bussell. And those recently have also shown that their redox and pH gradients can again synthesize amino acids on those locations. So we'll always get those amino acids everywhere. So here, after putting those things together, I wanted to play around with my computational resources and skills, and see if something can be explained for origins of life phenomena, for to access something very difficult to go to lab and do, something very long ago in the conditions that we don't have now to test hypothesis. And it was based upon the environments I knew, so hydrothermal vents, the pH gradient of both acidities, the minerals that were present on it, which ions and water, and which small organic molecules could have been, thanks to Miliori here, and of course to the previous hypothesis stated by Bernal. And remembering this problem of clay minerals overprotected form peptides, and that's why we can discover them in meteorites rather than make them and keep them there. So I'm not surprised with this news coming out. So here, what I've done is it's a clay system, so it's a layered double hydroxides, and they're, for example, green rust that were very present on early Earth at the point of life formation. They're not very common anymore, so it's iron 2, iron 3. Here, because of the force field and parameters I could access, I've used magnesium aluminium, but it does not change things dramatically from perspective of molecular modeling, because it's an ion of a given size with a given charge, and the charges here are preserved, and the layers are as well are of a very, very comparable structures. Also, magnesium aluminium hydroxides that I've studied were quite commonly present on early Earth, especially in the hydrothermal vents. They are part of the geochemical processes that are occurring there. So what I observed is that they do allow to intercalate amino acids very well into their layers, even at a very well. So this is level of hydration on the x-axis. Even at very, very hydrated levels, we're always getting nearly 70–80% of amino acids being absorbed onto surfaces. And you know how people are very good at seeing patterns. So I looked from this guys, I turned them around, looked above, and I could see there's something closing next to each other. So, and this is the oxygens and nitrogens highlighted of the two amino acids. I'm like, they're well aligned and they seemed very similar. So I analyzed it as a reactive pairs. And of course, if you dehydrate, they're more reactive pairs because things come close to each other. But in any case, here we're looking around 5% of reactive pairs being present. Yes, it's not a lot, but they're there. And interestingly here as well, there's mixture 1 and mixture 2. This is just mixture 1 is just a mixture of all of the amino acids that are present before, and mixture 2 is a very dilute mixture. And the rest is compensated with ions and salts. So mixture 1 still behaves reasonably well. It's never completely zero. So there's still pairs coming together. This is just an example of some of the alignments. The other question I was asked is what are the charges? So here I've transferred from molecular dynamics into ferrocritic DFT and looked at the charges. And indeed, amino acids at early Earth conditions of a very high pH were very negatively charged on their carboxylic group. And that would not allow for the nucleophilic attack. Upon absorption on the clays, this charge is redistributed significantly and would be promoting this nucleophilic attack. It would be possible. The other question is energy, as I've already mentioned before. And here, this is very difficult, one, because you don't want it to be actually too reactive, because that would remove a lot of control. But some of the energy that would drive this peptide bond formation, that's a loss of water in a wet, water-rich environment. I mean, why would it be happening? So we looked at the rehydration energies, and at all times, for all of the systems we have set up, it would still be increasing. Interestingly, for loss of one water due to formation of the peptide bond, it would give us enough energy more than enough energy to drive the reaction itself. And the other interesting part that we have not observed on a standard clays that are silicate clays is mobilization. Because there's one thing is forming those proteins, and another thing is allowing them to move, to fold, and to desorb. So here, the rehydration would allow those peptides to float away. They will also come together into those, due to hydrophobic collapse, into the clunks that will be moving around, and be forming a very charged group. For example, here, it will start moving on a less densely charged surface, picking up more of components. So I was like, oh, right, great, got it. So this makes perfect sense. I've got it. So I propose this mechanism of reaction where two amino acids absorb on their carboxylic group onto layered double hydroxide, float next to each other, align, hop on top of each other, by such releasing one of the charge sites, allowing a new amino acid to float next to it. Since they're mobile and they're still bounded by one point, while the backbone is growing out, it will come over, hop onto it again, and continue growing this chain. And this would be very similar of what we're actually having now for formation of peptide proteins on our body. And then I was like, well, it's going to just continue, right? Because as a theoretician, I just have this hypothesis sometimes until we run out of amino acids or we have sufficiently rehydrated and there's no energetic benefit from it. And I went to my experimental collaborator and I was, Brian, I can do this. And he tells me, yeah, this is great, but I can get to maximum of 4 amino acid long peptides. And that's it. I'm stuck. I mean, 4 amino acid long peptides is fantastic, but we need more than that to start talking about anything useful for to propagate further into life. So then I was thinking, what am I missing? And it's sometimes good to go outside and see that there's a moon and there are clouds and there are cycles. So Earth is tidal. Early Earth tides were even greater than the current ones. There are other reasons for dehydration. So from all of the computational work, only nothing experimental was fed into this model of rehydration, dehydration cycles. And it was very interesting to observe. So this is the length of the forming peptides. And here we have up to 6, but realistically 4 peptides. And that's exactly what amino acid long peptides in here, formation on the first cycle. And that's what I have originally modeled. And that's what Brian did in his work. And then as we rehydrate and dehydrate, we just allow this little desorption that we've observed from modeling to lose a little bit and to repopulate and repopulate and repopulate. And that means that we're getting to something. So here I'm saying 12, but 12 plus. Here we're getting to 20 amino acid long peptides upon, or even more, upon basically a fortnight worth of tides, for example. Or it also can be just a dehydration in some sort of pond, or dehydration due to geochemical activity, very local geochemical activity. So while it's something very difficult to do experimentally in a lab, just because it takes a lot of time to dehydrate to rehydrate, and it's a slow process, and the yields are very low. And I guess this is what made it so. That's why it's never been tested past 1 cycle so far. I guess, I hope. I know that before Beryl got locked down, there was a group working on it, on this theory. So what I wanted just to show you is that how through computational work here, we can build a hypothesis based on what we already know and try to add something here that would allow us to form to get an idea of what else could be possible that we can then maybe test and learn more or search for something. And this, obviously, being computational work, we can do it much safer, cheaper than missions. I won't say faster, but I mean, most of the work is not doing it, is thinking how to start it and how to make sense out of what you're getting. And this is just quite a simple, straightforward way of getting ordered peptides that can fold and be removed from the interlayers in the early Earth conditions. And it's very simple, very simple one. And for whatever everything I've presented today, these are people I have to have worked with, and I'm very happy to have worked with them. And it was done mainly in Durham University, Oxford, and some stuff in Edinburgh, where I'm now. And we'll always have to acknowledge our sponsors, because where would we be without them? And also, thank you very much. I'm even still within time. And yes, please ask me questions.
Thank you, Valentina, for your presentation. A question from Lev Sarkisov: can you use Reacts MD to look at chemical equilibria for confined amino acid systems?
So that's a good one, because React, so you're thinking about React FF, yeah? I guess. So we've tried React FF, and it was not great, unfortunately. I would like to. I think it's a great idea, but yeah, we couldn't even get simpler systems to work well. I think there is a part of it being also clays and a lot of metals, systems, charges. So what I've been doing in such a situation is running MD, then sampling, taking representative structures, putting them into DFT. And I work with CUSTEP that allows me periodicity, and it's quite fast for size of repeat units and that I have to study, and then looking at what happens there. And then building upon that, going kind of back into MD to refine it or to look at the next step of the process.
Okay, good. Next question. I have a question. In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned you listed different conditions, harsh conditions that correspond to the early Earth, I think. Mm-hmm. So I just wondered if you or some other scientists try to do simulations of, I think, simple particles at these conditions, and whether they could observe, for example, aggregation at least of these simple particles that could indicate that indeed these conditions are enough in order to at least form aggregates.
So yes, so basically the answer here is, I think, lays into the Titan, where all of the studies, it was remarkable actually, were computational, so suggesting, so you can still share, I can still see my screen, I guess, right? Suggesting this isotopes, for example. So it was completely done computationally, and yes, theoretically it is possible. There have been experimental remodeling of it, and also, yes, it makes sense. For early Earth conditions, they weren't that kind of crazy. What we do have, so we can reproduce it even in the lab, or at least what we know, because there's a lot of our debates about what, and there were loads of different locations, etc., that could have played a role. We can make it in a lab, but it's very difficult to handle. So, for example, I've just before we all got locked down, I was visiting a group who are working on green rust, and I have never appreciated how difficult it is to work with it, because it's very air sensitive. Obviously, early Earth did not have it. We're also looking at the geological processes. Sometimes they are driven by temperatures and pressures that are very difficult to set in a lab. And in the case of green rust, it's a transitional mineral that we don't know the kind of the stability properly on the early Earth conditions. It is very sensitive to things. So yes, so we can make it, and we can do it also computationally. But yeah, it's difficult to basically handle. Does this answer your question of models and experiments?
Another question, if this is more a technical question, which computational tools do you use in your study, and which methods, computational methods,
yeah.
do you use? Do you use, for example, closer to the end, you showed a picture, I think, of clay.
So
molecules are soft on the surface. For example, if you check this example, do you use molecular dynamics? Which software do you use?
For example, this picture, right? This picture, like these pictures. So all of the stuff I've done was with GROMACS. I love GROMACS. It's fast. So it's MD. It's very straightforward MD. There are not. I am running it with ClayFF force field. There are few options. There are not many options for modeling of clays. I really like ClayFF. It's quite simple. It's fast and it works. So that's a good start. Everything is done in GROMACS. Because it allows. So I've used it for a long time, and that's also a reason. It also allows enough flexibility without sacrificing the speed. Because yes, I know there are faster engines, but they do not allow me for the flexibility to be able to use force fields I want to use, to be able to use clay force fields. And obviously that's core for me. And so they're over the list. A lot of these systems are done in LAMs. And I don't want to say anything bad, but LAMs is very slow, and it really is a killer basically when you want to model big systems that you have to. LAMs has got, of course, its own reasons, and it can do a lot of things that GROMACS can't. So if anyone is interested, on my website, there's a tutorial on how to do this. It is a little bit out of date, so it's using previous version of GROMACS, but it will give you a good idea of where to start and what to do.
Okay, thank you for your answer. I think we don't have questions anymore, so I would like to thank Lev and Valentina for their time and presentations. Next time on Friday there will be 2 lectures. One from Dmitry Lepshin, that's me. I will talk about gas-liquid interfaces and adsorption at the gas-liquid interface. And another speaker is Dr. Brandon O'Conshaw from IBM, and he will speak about solid-liquid interfaces and adsorption at this interface. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.